Good day everyone, my name is Nikki Carpe and I'm here to present to you our topic on week 7 which talks about alternative obligations. On week 7, we will be talking about alternative obligations, facultative obligations, joint and solidary obligations. Now, when we talk about alternative obligations under Article 1199, at least one prestation must be performed by a person who's bound to multiple prestations. Alternative obligations has two kinds. First one is simple obligation. It simply means that only one prestation is due. So, for example, D obliged himself to deliver a piano to C. The second kind of alternative obligation is compound obligation. This means that there are two or more prestations due. This also has two kinds. The first one is the conjunctive obligation. This simply means that all several prestations are due. Then the second one is distributive obligation. One or more prestations are due. And under distributive obligations, this can be an alternative obligation itself. All prestations are due, but one prestation is enough to perform or fulfill the obligation. And then the second one is the facultative obligation. One prestation is due, but the debtor may offer a substitute. So now let's dive deeper into the meaning of alternative obligations. Alternative obligation is a situation where a debtor is committed to performing several different prestations or obligations, but performing just one of them is sufficient enough to completely settle your obligation. Let's say, for example, a farmer, Mang Tonyo, owes Aling Nena. So to settle his debt to Aling Nena, they agree on an alternative obligation. So their alternative obligations are, Mang Tonyo promises to give Aling Nena either 10 sacks of rice, or his carabao, or to paint her house. Since that's an alternative obligation, completing one of them is sufficient enough to complete the obligation. According to Article 1200, the general rule is the right of choice belongs to the debtor. This means the person who owes the obligation is the one who decides which of the alternative prestations to perform. However, there are exceptions to this rule. The right of choice can be granted to the creditor or even a third person, but this must be explicitly stated in the agreement. It's also important to note that the debtor's choice is not unlimited. There are certain limitations, such as the debtor cannot choose prestations that are impossible, unlawful, and not the object of obligation. So, even the debtor has the right of choice, it is not absolute. It also has its limits. The debtor can lose its right of choice when, among the prestations he is alternatively bound to, only one is practicable. In this case, the obligation is converted into a simple one. Impossible prestations means you cannot choose an obligation that is physically impossible. Next, the unlawful prestation. So this means that you can choose to do something illegal to fulfill an obligation. And then the next one is only one prestation is practicable. This means that when all but one of your choices are gone, you lose the right to choose. And then lastly, not the object of obligation. So this means that you can choose something that was never an option in the first place. Your choices are limited to what you originally agreed upon. After we talk about the right of choice, now let's talk about communicating your choice. This article 1201, the choice shall produce no effect except by the time it has been communicated. Communication of notice that choice has been made. The rule is simple. The choice has no legal effect until it is communicated. This means that even if the debtor has already decided which prestation to perform, the obligation is still considered an alternative obligation until the creditor is officially notified. So once the notice is given to the creditor, this key things happens. The alternative obligations become a simple obligation. The other options are now off the table. And the choice is now also irrevocable. You can't change your mind once it's communicated and agreed upon both sides. How do you prove you've made a choice? So the person who made the choice is responsible for proving that they told the other person. However, the law is flexible about how you do this. You don't need any special form or document. The notice can be oral or in writing, and it can be done expressly. Now let's look at this article 1202. This article states that the debtor loses the right of choice when among the alternative prestations only one is practicable. So the main idea in this article, if circumstances change and all other options became impossible or impracticable, the obligations automatically transforms. It is no longer an alternative obligation, but a simple obligation to perform. So this provision also prevents a debtor to from simply walking away from their obligation when their preferred choices are no longer available. Now, let's talk about what happens if the creditor's actions are the reason that the debtor can't make a choice. Now, in this article 1203, it states that if the creditor's actions make it impossible for the debtor to make a choice from the alternative obligations, the debtor can choose to rescind the contract with the right to damages. So, rescinding a contract means the obligation is canceled. The debtor is no longer bound to perform, and that they have the right to seek compensation for any harm caused by the creditor's action. Now think of it this way. Of course, the creditor can't benefit from their own wrongdoing if their actions were the reason all the alternative options were lost. If everything is lost, the debtor is now released from the obligations entirely and can be even compensated from it. So this is a way of contract where it's a protection for the debtor in an alternative obligation in case something happens. Now let's talk about Article 1204. In this article, it states that the creditor has the right to an indemnity for damages if the debtor, due to their own fault, loses all the alternative items. Now this applies in a couple of situations. First one is when some of the objects are lost, and the second one is when all of the objects are lost. The first one, it refers to a situation where a debtor loses some but not all. And the second one is all of the objects. Refers to a situation where all the items in an alternative obligations are lost. Let's break down the rules of lost objects in an alternative obligation by discussing with a few simple scenarios. So the first scenario is if a single item is lost or some of the items. If the debtor is at fault, they still have to fulfill their obligation by choosing from the remaining options they have. It's just that their choices are simply reduced. If the loss is due to a fortuitous event, an unforeseen event like a natural disaster, their options are also reduced, but the obligation to choose from the remaining items still stands. Now let's dive into the second scenario where all items are lost. If the debtor is at fault, the obligation is no longer alternative. The debtor is liable for the damages, and the obligations becomes a simple one to pay for the value of the very last item that was lost. If all the items are lost due to a fortuitous event, the obligation is completely extinguished. Since it was not the debtor's fault, they are no longer liable to perform or pay for the damages. This clearly shows that the debtor's responsibility depends on whether the loss was their fault or an unavoidable event. So now let's talk about the basis of indemnity. In this article 1204, it tells us also how the damages are calculated. So the rule is simple. The debtor must pay the value of the last thing that was lost or became impossible to perform. The amount of damages is not based on most valuable item or an average of all items, but specifically on the value of the very last item that disappeared. So far, we've talked about situations where the debtor has the right to choose. But what if the right of choice is given to the creditor? So in this article 1205, it states that the rules for alternative obligations when the creditor has given or has been given the right to choose, the obligations becomes a simple one from the moment the choice is communicated to the debtor. So remember, the right of choice belongs to the creditor only when it has been explicitly stated in the contract or it's communicated with the debtor. So once the creditor makes their choice and communicates it to the debtor, the obligation becomes a simple one. The responsibility of the debtor then depends on what happens to the item. So let's say if an item is lost through a fortuitous event like a natural disaster, the obligation becomes simply shifts to the remaining options, and the creditor must choose what's left. Just like the first example that we've discussed. And now, if an item or if a thing is lost because of the debtor's fault, the creditor can either choose one of the remaining options or demand the value of the item that was lost along with the damages. And then the next one is if all things or if all items are lost because of the debtor's fault, the creditor can demand the value of any items plus the damages. But it cannot be all of the items, the value of all of the items, but any of the item. Now let's briefly talk about on how this applies to personal obligations. Those that are promise to do something like a service. So same rules apply here. If you promise to do a service for someone but can't because a random event or a fortuitous event you couldn't control, you are released from the obligation. And the obligation or the promise is now canceled. However, if you are the reason the service became impossible to perform, let's say because you were careless or at fault, then you have to pay the damages. So this shows that the principles of alternative obligations extend beyond physical objects and also cover promises to perform actions. The key is still determining who is at fault for the loss of the choice. So while an alternative obligation gives a debtor a choice to choose between several prestations, a facultative obligation is different. In this case, there is only one main prestation due, but the debtor has the right to substitute it with another. Think of it this way. In an alternative obligation, for example, you owe me a ring, a watch, or a car. All three are due, but you only have to give one because one prestation performed is already sufficient enough to cover the obligation. And in a facultative obligation, for example, you owe me a ring, but you have the option to give me a watch instead. The watch is your substitute. So let's wrap up our discussion about facultative obligation with a very important point, which is the effect of loss. This is where the difference between alternative and facultative obligations becomes crystal clear. There are two key scenarios. The first one is before substitution. Here, if the main item is lost due to a random event or unforeseen event, the obligation is gone. The loss of substitute doesn't matter at all because it's not the primary object of the obligation. Let's go back at our first example. If you promise a piano, which is the main item, with an LCD television set as a substitute, and a fire destroys the piano before you could make your choice, you are no longer obligated to give the TV. This means that the entire obligation is now extinguished or completely done. The next scenario is after substitution. This one is different. It's once you choose the substitute and communicate it, the original main item's loss doesn't matter. Why? Because the obligation is now a simple one to deliver the substitute. It's now a simple one because you need to deliver the substitute since it's the one that you chose. You've already made your choice, and the new obligation is to deliver that specific item. So this is a fundamental difference. In a facultative obligation, the loss of item or the loss of the main item under certain circumstances extinguishes the entire obligation. In an alternative obligation, the loss of one item just reduces the choices for you to make. So to bring everything together, let's summarize the key differences between alternative and facultative obligations. So there are actually 4 main points. This will help you remember the difference between the two. The first main point is the number of prestations. In an alternative obligation, you owe several things, but you only need to give one. In a facultative obligation, you owe one specific thing, but you have the option to swap or substitute it with another. The next point is right of choice. For an alternative obligation, the debtor usually chooses, but the creditor can also choose if the contract says so. For a facultative obligation, only the debtor has the right to make the switch. And on the third point, loss through a fortuitous event or an accident, in an alternative obligation, if one option is lost by accident, the obligation continues with the remaining choices. In a facultative obligation, if the main item is lost, the entire obligation is extinguished or it's done. And the last main point is loss through the fault of the debtor. In an alternative obligation, losing one option by your fault doesn't mean you owe damages because you can still give another. You still have other choices. In a facultative obligation, if you lose the main item by your fault, you are liable for the damages. The loss of the substitute is irrelevant until you choose it. So understanding these 4 points is the key to mastering the differences between these two important types of obligations, the alternative obligations and the facultative obligations. So now let's dive into our next topic that will be discussed by Lyka, Clare, Cleofas.
So thank you, Ms. Carpe. I am Lyka, Clare, Cleofas, tackle about section 4, joint and solidary obligation. Article 1207. Article 1207. Article 1207. Establish presumptions against solidarity liability. So this civil code is an important presumption. So when several debtors or creditors are bound by one obligation, the law presumes that it is joint and not solidarity. So bakit? Kasi ang solidarity or in solidarity, one debtor may be made to pay the entire debt, and the one creditor may claim the entire credit. So this is an exceptional situation. So the law therefore does not presume solidarity unless there is a clear basis. Either the contract expressly provide it, or nirequire to ng law, or dahil dineman to ng nature of the obligation. Now, let's proceed to the meaning of joint and solidary obligation. In a joint obligation, each debtor is liable only for his or her proportionate share of the debt. So, means that when there are two or more debtors, each responsible only for pay own share of the debt. the creditor cannot demand. So, for example, Angel, Maria, and Berto borrow 90,000 from Jace. So, each of them agree will only be liable for their own share. So, Angel, Maria, Berto pay 30,000. If Maria does not pay, Jace cannot ask cannot ask Angel or Berto to cover Maria's 30,000 because their liability is separate. In a solidarity obligation naman, each debtor liable for entire debt. So, in solidarity, liability is total. The creditor may demand the entire obligation from any one debtor. So, for example, dito, Angel, Maria, and Berto borrow 90,000 from Jace. Each of them agree will only be liable for the entire debt. So, any of them can be asked to pay because of solidarity obligation. The entire 90,000 pesos, the creditor can choose whom to demand payment from. Next, we talk about the collective obligation presumed to be joint. If an obligation involves multiple debtors or creditors and does not directly declare it is solidarity. So we have two examples here. Multiple debtors and one creditor. Multiple debtors and creditors. So the first example, A, B, and C borrow 15,000 from D. Since from that scenario, there is no extra speculation that the obligation is solidary. The law neither requires or the nature obligation either requires. Ito nga yung sinasabi ko kanina. Solidary liability, so therefore there is a presumption that obligation is nearly joint. In this scenario, we have multiple debtors and only one credit. Meaning to say, liability A, B, and C ng utang kay D, although the obligation was contracted at the same time, so a new effect against joint obligation, D can collect only up to 5,000 from A, B, C. The obligation is joint, abolition proportionate. And for the next example, A and B borrow 15,000 from C and D. So, the presumption here still apply. There are two debts and two credits. Two credit each. So, creditor can demand only 7,500 from either debtor. So, each debtor then has the liability of 7,500 each. So, if the obligation is against joint, creditor C cannot collect more than 7,500 from D because her right only is up to 7,500, so they also cannot collect from A kasi nga the obligation joint. On the other hand, the debtors cannot or are not required to pay more than 7,500 each kasi liability nila is up to 7,500 only. The obligation is joint, meaning there is a proportionate share for each of the debtors and for each of the credit. So when obligation becomes solidary? Under Article 1207, solidary is never presumed. It exists only in four situations. When the obligation expressly so state. Example ko na lang is yung mga na-example ko doon sa taas kanina. Angel, Maria, and Berto bind themselves jointly and severally liable to pay Jace. So, the pangalawa is the law requires solidary. So, example dito under the tort law. When two or more persons are responsible for a wrongful act, they may be held solidarity liable for damages. So, yung C is the nature of the obligation requires solidarity, and yung D, when impose a final judgment against several defendants. So now, let's talk about naman the words used to indicate solidarity liability. Sometimes the intention for solidarity is not direct but implied by the language of the contract. Some phrases is that indicate solidarity include jointly and severally. Solidaria, in solido or in solidum, together and or separately, individually and or collectively. Juntos separadamente, Spanish legal term. Or simple when the obligation is signed by two or more persons with wording that implies full liability. Now, let's proceed to the kinds of solidarity. Solidarity can be classified in two ways, according to the parties bound and according to the source. So, according to the parties bound, we have two, the passive solidarity and the active solidarity. This in the part of the debtor. So, any one debtor may be compelled to pay the entire obligation. Guys, paulit-ulit na ako ng explanation talaga kasi kung makikita nyo talaga nagko-connect siya at maiintindihan nyo. For example, example ko na ulit dito si Ana, si Maria, si Berto, and si Jade. So, if Ana, Maria, and Berto are solidarity liable for 90,000, Jade can demand the entire 90,000 from Maria alone. So, active solidarity is on the part of the creditor. Any one creditor may demand the entire debt from the debtor. After receiving payment, he will share it with co-creditors. So, example is C and D are solidarity creditors of 90,000. So, C alone can demand the full 90,000 from the debtor. Article 1209. The Civil Code of the Philippines that in joint indivisible obligation. So, this article applies the joint indivisible obligation because the prestation or object is not liable of division. So, yung solidarity naman is not provided. So, indivisible, ano nga ba yung indivisible? It means the object cannot be divided without altering its essence. So, for example, is yung delivering a car or yung mga specific painting. Article 1210. The Civil Code of the Philippines state that an indivisible obligation is one where the prestation or object cannot be performed by parts without altering the essence or substance. So, yung indivisibility kasi is nagre-refer siya sa nature of the obligation. So, the obligation is cannot be performed in parts. So, yung solidarity naman is nagre-refers to sa relationship among parties. So, whether a creditor can demand the whole or whether a debtor can be compelled to pay the whole. So, those an obligation can be indivisible but not solidarity and vice versa. Article 1211. The Civil Code of the Philippines states that solidarity may still exist even if the debtors or creditors are not bound in the same way or same period. So, for example is may have the three debtors may all be solidarity liable for 150,000. So, even one promises pay in cash or yung isa pa promises pay with goods. So, the third promises naman is pay after 30 days. So, we have kinds of solidarity. Yung uniform and non-uniform. Yung uniform kasi when the debtors are bound by the same terms and condition or stipulation. So, ang non-uniform naman when the debtors while bound under the same obligation. So, like yung loan are not subject to the same terms and condition of payment but different secondary stipulation. Article 1212. The Civil Code of the Philippines state a relationship of mutual agency exists by the among solidarity creditors. So, the act of one will affect others because of their relationship. Solidarity creditors may perform acts which useful or beneficial to the others. So, kaya nga every solidarity creditors is nagbe-benefit to by the useful act of one. Article 1213. A Civil Code of the Philippines state a solidarity creditors cannot simply assign his right to a third person without the consent of the others. So bakit? Because the right to demand the entire obligation belongs collectively to all creditors. So, kaya nga the law protects the solidarity of creditors by requiring the agreement before any transfer of rights.
1214 is about kapag maraming creditor, the debtor can choose kung kanino siya magbabayad. Pero kapag nagdemand ang isa sa mga creditor, dapat doon ibayad ni debtor sa nagdemand. So, for example, nangutang si Ben ng 40,000 kay Lyka. So, kapag walang nagdemand both of them, Ben can pay the 40,000 to Maymay and Lyka. Pero kapag nagdemand si Lyka na sa kanya ibayad ni Ben, then Ben must pay Lyka only. Payment to Maymay after Lyka demand is valid, pero liable pa rin si Ben. Article 125 is about the novation, compensation, confusion, or remission of the debt made by any of the solidary creditors or with any of the solidary debtors should extinguish the obligation without the prejudice to the provision of Article 1219. So first, I'll explain the novation, compensation, confusion, or remission. So, the first one is the novation, replace the new obligation. So, for example, AZ and AD nangutang kay Ana ng 10,000. Pero dahil walang pera si AZ, ginawa niyang pambayad yung motor niya for the payment. So, meaning, yung utang na pera na replace ng new obligation. So, the next one is the compensation. Debt cancel each other. So, for example, AZ and AD nangutang ng 40,000 kay Ana, but Ana also owes AZ ang money amounting to 40,000. So, the debt cancel out. Next one is the confusion. Debtor and creditor become the same person. So, for example, AZ and AD nangutang kay Ana worth 20,000 and Ana sell his phone to AZ as part of the payment. Ana transfers to AZ's right as the creditors in the 20,000 debt, so AZ become creditor and debtor. For the last one is a remission, forgives the debt. So for example, AZ and AD is nangutang kay Ana and Ana forgive AZ sa kanyang utang. So the obligation is settled. But AD is still liable to pay Ana because Ana forgives only AZ. So back to 1215 article means if novation, compensation, confusion, and remissions happens, the obligation is settled. One of the solidary debtor is binayaran nyo ng whole yung utang, the obligation is settled. But, the debtor can demand his or her co-debtors the reimbursement of the proper share. So, for example, AZ and AD nangutang kay Ana ng 10,000. Before the due date, AZ pays the entire 10,000, yung utang is settled na. So, AZ can demand to AD her share since they are two debtors, each share is 5,000. Article 1216 means the creditor has the choice. So, the creditor can demand payment from any solidary debtors, from some or from all at the same time. So, even the creditors as the debtor, he can still ask others specifically if hindi pa ibayad yung utang. So, for example, AZ, AD, and ICE ay nangutang kay Ana ng 50,000. Ana can collect 50,000 to AZ alone. Ask 20,000 from AD and 30,000 from ICE or demand from all three at the same time. Next is kung naningil si Ana kay AZ but AZ can only pay 10,000, so Ana pwede pa rin niya singilin si AD and ICE for the remaining balance. 1217 means first, one solidary debtors pays the whole debt settled. So for example, AZ, AD, ICE nangutang kay Ana ng 20,000. So, binayaran ni AC yung 20,000 ng full. So, the obligation is settled sa lahat. So, second is creditor choice if multiple debtors offer to pay. So, AZ and AD wants to pay, Ana can choose whose offer to accept between them. So, number 3, right of the debtor to reimburse to his or her co-debtors. So, for example, AZ, AD, and ICE nangutang kay Ana ng 20,000. binayaran ni AZ ng full yung 20,000. So, AZ can demand reimbursement to AD and ICE for their shares. So, pang-apat is debtors cannot demand interest to other co-debtors if he pays early. So, for example, if AZ paid the 30,000 before the due date, he cannot ask AD and ICE to add interest when they reimburse him. So, last one is if one debtor cannot pay. So, for example, if AZ cannot pay, the co-debtor share the unpaid amount. Effect of payment by a solidary debtor. First, between the solidary debtors and creditors means if one of the debtor pays, the whole debt is settled. So, for example, AZ and AD nangutang kay Ana ng 20,000 and si AC binayaran niya na ng full payment. So, the obligation is settled. So, if two or more solidary debtors offers to pay, the creditor has the right to choose which offer to accept. So, for example, AZ and AD nangutang kay Ana and AZ and AD offers to pay, Ana has the right to choose which offer to accept both of them. So, second, among the solidary debtors means the solidary debtors who paid can ask the other to reimburse their share. So, for example, binayaran ni AC yung utang. So, may karapatan siyang singilin yung other co-debtors niya sa kanilang shares. So, pangalawa, if the one debtors cannot pay, the loss shared by all including the one who paid. So, for example, AC cannot pay the utang. So, ICE and AD, sila yung magbabayad nun kasi nga hindi makapagbayad si AC. So, third one is among the solidary creditors means the creditor who received payments must share it with other debtors. So, for example, if there are 3 creditor, AZ, AD, and ICE, AC received money galing sa debtor. So, AZ must give AD and ICE shares. AZ cannot keep the money kasi the money belongs to the 3 creditors. 1218 is payment by a solidary debtor should not entitle him to reimbursement from his co-debtors if such payment is made after the obligation has prescribed or become illegal. So, meaning, kapag si debtor is binayaran pa rin yung utang kahit prescribed na, he cannot demand reimbursement to his co-debtors. So, for example, AZ and AD solidarily indebted to Ana in the amount of 30,000 under written contract. So, kapag written contract, the prescriptive period is 10 years. So, the debt of AZ and AD due on February 10, 2005. Bali kapag hindi nag-file si Ana within 10 years by February 10, 2015, the obligation is prescribed. If AZ pay full of their debt in February 11, 2015 to Ana, AZ cannot demand to AD reimbursement because the debt is already extinguished for prescription. So, meaning, yung binayaran ni AZ is voluntarily. So, next is the prescriptive periods of action. So, yung meaning ng prescription, ito yung rights or actions can be lost if not used in the certain period of time. So, in law, if you don't file a case or enforce your right within the set period, you can no longer demand it in a court. So, the first one is 10-year for written contracts, obligation created by law, judgment, or court decisions. Diba? 6-year for oral contract and quasi-contract. Third is 4-year for quasi-delicts and injury to rights. Article 1219. Kapag ang creditor sinabihan yung isang debtor na i-forgive yung share, hindi ibig sabihin na hindi na siya magbabayad sa co-debtors niya. Effect of remission of share after payment. First, if payment was made first, the remission has no effect. So, for example, AZ, AD, and ICE is nangutang kay Ana ng 120,000. Binayaran ng buo ni AC yung utang kay Anna, and after Anna received the payment, she said to Ice, I forgive your share na 40,000. So, Ice is still need to pay or Ice is still liable to AC because AC paid the already before the remission. Second, if remission was made first, the debtor whose share is remitted is released. So, for example, same scenario, Anna tells to Ice before the payment that he forgive him to his share na 40,000. Then AZ pays the full. So Ice is not liable to AZ because the remission happens before the payment. Bali, pwede lang singilin ni AC is si AD amount to 60,000 and another 60,000 is i-shoulder na ni AZ. Article 1220 is the remission of the whole obligation obtained by one of the solidary debtors does not entitle him to reimbursement from his co-debtors. So, meaning, kapag ang creditor sinabi na wag na bayaran yung utang in favor of one solidary debtor. So, for example, AZ and AD and Ice is nangutang kay Ana amounting of 100,000. So, sinabi ni Ana na kay AZ na wag na bayaran yung 100,000. So, the obligation is settled. Pero hindi pwedeng maningil si AC sa mga co-debtors niya which is si AD and Ice because wala naman siyang binayaran. So, next one is no right to reimbursement in case of remission. First, only someone who actually paid the debt has the right to ask others for their share. So, kapag wala kang binayaran, wag kang maniningil sa ibang co-debtors mo. Next one is there is no payment, only forgiveness in remission. Third is the debtor who benefited from remission cannot demand money from his co-debtors. Article 1221, loss of the thing or impossibility of performance, is if the thing is lost or prestation becomes impossible without fault and before delay, the obligation is extinguished. Second, but if there is fault or delay, all solidary debtors are liable to the creditor. Rules in case thing has been lost or prestation has become impossible. First, loss is without fault before delay. Obligation is extinguished. So, for example, AZ and AD promised to deliver the cow to Ana. But before madalan ni AZ and AD kay Ana, namatay yung cow dahil sa disease. So, nobody is liable. Second, loss is due to fault on the part of solidary debtor. So, all are liable to creditor. Guilty debtor must reimburse co-debtors. So, for example, AZ and AD promised to deliver the laptop valued 10,000 but AZ destroyed it. Both AZ and AD are liable to Ana, but AZ must reimburse AD. Third, loss without fault but after delay. If debtors are in delay, they are liable even if the thing is lost by accident. So, for example, AZ and AD must deliver speaker to Ana, but AZ and AD delayed the delivery. After the due date, the speaker is destroyed by fire. So, even if it is accident, AZ and AD is liable because they already delay the item. Article 122, defenses available to a solidary debtor. So, meaning, a solidary debtor may use certain defenses when sued by the creditor. Second, these defenses can either cancel the whole obligation, apply only to himself, or apply only to a part of the debt. Defenses available to a solidary debtor. First, defense derived from the nature of obligation means nullifies the whole obligation, complete defense. So, for example, AZ, AD, and ICE is solidary debtors of 50,000 to Ana, but ICE proves na yung utang is nabayaran na. Since yung obligation is extinguished, wala na sa kanilang tatlo ang liable. Second, defense personal to or which pertain to share of debtor sued, meaning complete defense but only for him or partial for his share. So, for example, AZ and AD and ICE are solidary debtors of 20,000. Ana sues AD but AD proves he was a minor when he signed the contract. So AD is not liable, but AZ and IZ are still liable for the whole 20,000. So last one is defenses personal to other solidary debtors, partial defense for the co-debtor share. So for example, AZ and AD and IZ is nangutang ng 150,000. Anna sues IZ, but IZ shows that Anna already condoned AZ 150,000 share. So IZ is still liable but only 100,000, and AD and IZ can share the 100,000, so 50,000 each.